Let's make use of some of our newfound abilities with control structures and see if we can do a little bit of form validation. Form validation, of course, is a pretty common basic task, something that we'll end up doing quite often in PHP, since forms are so frequently used to collect data from the user, and users are, of course, so prone to making errors, or at least not always necessarily giving us the data that we expect them to give us. Form validation becomes something that we have to do, something that is very important to the functioning of a lot of PHP scripts. What I've put together here then is a basic form. On this form, I've given the user 3 text fields. As you can see, I have a field for first name, a field for last name, and a field for zip code. We could imagine that in the future, what we might do with this data is collect it from the user and then store it in a database, maybe tuck it away in a file somewhere, just depending on exactly what the idea of our particular application is. But one way or another, I would want to check the values that the user provides for these 3 fields and make sure that they meet my opinion of what is valid and what is not, what is needed or what isn't needed for my script before I actually proceeded to the step where I would store the data that they had supplied. Let's say that our criteria for valid data here is that all 3 fields are required, none of them can be left blank. Let's say then in addition to that that the zip code also has to be numeric. Has to be a number completely. Given that, what we could do is we could put together a little bit of validation, and what I would want to do with that validation, of course, is to try and be as friendly with it as possible to the user. By friendly, what I mean is that if the user does do something that we don't expect, I would want to, in the most clear and concise way that I can, make sure that the user understands how it is that their input has differed from what it is that I expected them to give me, so that they could then as quickly and easily make changes to this form to get the data into the form that I'm expecting it to be in, get the data into good shape so that we could actually make use of it. So essentially what I'd like to do here is when the user fills out the form, if we do find errors, I would mostly like to do 2 different things. One of those things is maybe here between the header and the form itself, I would like to show the user some what amounts to error messages, letting them know what has gone wrong with the processing of the form. I would also, in some version of the script, also like to actually mark fields, do something to draw the user's attention to the particular fields that maybe are causing problems. And I would like to, in the case where the user completes the form successfully, to just maybe give them a message there above the form itself, letting them know that everything looks okay. That wouldn't be necessary probably in a more realistic version of this form, in that what we would do instead is store the data and redirect the user off to another page. But since we're not actually doing those things yet, for the moment I will settle for just a congratulations message, letting them know that everything looks okay. So let's take a look at how I might do this. Jumping over and looking at the code for this page, what I have is a self-submitting form. You can see my 3 text fields here. Nothing much going on there right now. And for starters, where I might begin is right about at this position in the script where I want to show the error message. I could begin by putting in a PHP block there, and I could begin doing a bit of form validation. Now, one thing I don't want to do is start the validation here immediately, because you have to remember what happens if the user hasn't even tried to fill out the form yet. What if it's the very first visit to the form, they haven't completed the form, they haven't clicked submit yet? This page, like a lot of these self-submitting pages that I've been showing you in examples, needs to differentiate between when the page has been first visited and when the page is being revisited because of submitted form data. So let me start off like this. I'm going to start off essentially with a big if statement. And in this big if statement, what I want to do is I want to see if the user has submitted any data. I'm going to do that by using the isSet function, and I'm going to say is data set for the post array containing a first name and a last name and a zip code, using the names of the fields that are set there below. I've actually provided 3 different arguments here to the isSet function. I don't know that I've mentioned before that the isSet function has the ability to take multiple values, but essentially what's going on here is that the isSet function should check all 3 of these separate values, and only if all 3 of them are set, only if all 3 of them do exist, will the isSet function return true, which would then make my if statement true. We could test this out. I could just throw an echo in here for the moment saying the form was submitted. Maybe I'll throw an else at the end of the if, and I'll echo the form hasn't been. I'll say has not been to avoid the comma or the quote confusion. Has not been submitted. There. Let's just see how that works. If I come back and visit, it says the form has not been submitted. If I hit continue, the form has been submitted. So it appears that that if statement with the isSet function is effective at being able to tell whether the form has been submitted or not. You might wonder, if I submit the form but I leave all the fields blank, is isSet true? And the answer is yes. A blank is still a valid value as far as isSet is concerned, right? If blanks are what's submitted from the form for these 3 indexes of the post array, then that still counts as something being there. Those indexes are still considered to have been set, even if they are blank. One other little thing I might mention about that if statement that's a bit important is that do I really need to check all 3 of these values? And I'd say the answer is probably yes. That's a good idea. We have to keep in mind something that I did mention briefly in a previous video, and that is that because this particular page, this particular script is playing the role not only of showing the user the initial form, but also of later processing the data submitted from the form, we have to keep in mind what would happen if somebody else put together their own version of this form and then had it submit to this page, used this page of mine as the action for the form they created. It's possible that they might put in different fields or different types of fields, and I want to make sure that before my script goes on and processes anything, that all of the data that I expect is actually present here. When somebody else puts together a form that submits to your script, kind of implicitly without you knowing it, that's sometimes referred to as a cross-site request forgery. It's maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing, kind of depending on the intentions of everybody involved, but it definitely is something that you want to be aware of. All right, let's see. Now that we know that this if statement can be effective at detecting whether the form was submitted or not, I really don't want to do anything if the form hasn't been submitted, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the else from my if statement there. What I want to do inside the if statement then, assuming the form has been submitted, is that's where I basically want to perform my validation. My validations of my fields could essentially take the form of just a series of if statements. So I could do something like, say, if from the post array, the first name value. And what I want to do is make sure it's not empty. Essentially, I want to react to it if it is empty. If it's not empty, then there's really no problem. So I'm going to say if empty using the empty function to determine if it is empty. And if it is empty, maybe I show the user an error message. I'll say the first name field cannot be empty. We could do something essentially just like that for the last name field as well. If I just copy what I just did for the first name field, do it for the last name field, that's great. And again, for the zip code field. But with the zip code field, I don't necessarily just want to check if it's empty. I want to specifically check if the zip code is numeric. So instead of using the empty function, PHP has a function is numeric, if I remember correctly. Let me also update my error messages. Last name field cannot be empty, and I'll say the zip code field must contain a number. Let's give that a try and see how that works. If I jump back over to my browser, I'm going to refresh the page. If I submit with the form all blank, I get first name field cannot be empty, last name field cannot be empty, nothing showing up for zip code. We'll have to go check that out and see why that's not working. But let's try this out. If I put in a first name test and submit, the error message for the first name field went away. Also though, did the value. That's not good. I'd like for the value to stay there, especially when the form is invalid so the user doesn't have to repeat their inputs. For last name, if I put in a value, then I only see the error message for first name. So the only problem here seems to be the values not repopulating the fields, and the fact that nothing seems to be happening for zip code. So let's look at those problems. Well, for starters, what could the problem with the zip code field be? I'm taking a look at the value from the zip code field and asking PHP if it's numeric. Maybe that's the problem. Is numeric would tell me true if it is numeric. I want to know if it's not numeric. So let me put a not in front of it there, and let's see if that works a little bit better. Come back over, refresh, submit. Now we're getting our error message for zip code. If I actually do put in a numeric zip code, the zip code error message goes away. If I put in a non-numeric zip code, the zip code error comes back. So that seems to fix that problem. Now how about repopulating the form with our values that the user has submitted? I can put values into those fields by simply putting them into the value HTML attribute for each one of those input tags. The thing I'm going to have to be careful of course, is that if I try to use the post values, what would happen if the form has not been submitted yet? What would happen on the initial visit to the page? What I basically need, I think, is some defaults. So let me jump back up to the very top of my script here, put in some PHP tags, and let me declare some default variables. Let me make a variable first name, and I'll set its default to blank, a last name variable, and a zip code variable. There we are. Those all start off as blank. Down in the actual fields themselves then, what I could do is I could echo those values. Echo the first name value, echo the last name value, and echo the zip code value. There. Now, that should work reliably. There will always be a first name, last name, and zip code variable, so I shouldn't have to worry about there being any type of error from those three statements. But they're also always blank at the moment. What I really need to do is determine whether I actually do have those values, and if I do, then I can take those values from the post array and put them there into those variables. There's a few different ways I could potentially do this. One of those ways would be to use if is set type statements. I could say if is set post first name. So if we do have a first name variable in the post array, then I could say into my first name variable, take the value from the post array, my first name index, and assign it to it. I could then do the same basic thing for last name and zip code. Let's just try it out here with first name and see if that works. Back over to my form. Let me just start it off again fresh, no errors, checking the code. I don't see any errors there either, so it looks like things are going well. If I put in a first name, the value stuck around, so it looked like that actually worked okay. So I could go ahead and repeat this process for last name and zip code, but I don't want to. I think there's another way that I could accomplish the same thing that would actually be a little bit easier. This other way for me to accomplish this basic idea is to use a PHP function called extract. What the extract function essentially does is it has the ability to pull values out of an array. So I could give it, for example, the post array. The post array is an array, so the extract function can extract values from it. In the case of an associative array, like the post array, what the extract function will actually do is it will create individual standalone variables that have the same name as the key in the array. So in the post array, if there is a key of first name, what the extract function will do is it will create a variable called first name and make sure that that variable has the value that holds that position in the array. Same thing, of course, for last name, same thing, of course, for zip code. I already have variables declared for those three things, so I've already got them there. They already exist. What I could do is, if I'm at all concerned with the extract function overriding other variables or not using the specific variables I want, there's a second argument I can provide to extract called extr if exists. This is the way I usually like to do extract. Basically what I'm doing is I'm telling extract, pull values out of the associative array, create the individual variables, but do it only if I've already created a variable to hold it. So if there were a variable in the post array called street address, that one would not be extracted because I have not created a variable called street address. But here I do have variables for first name, last name, and zip code, so those variables will be or those values will be extracted from the post array and will be put into my variables for me. Makes it a whole lot easier than doing all those individual if statements. Let's see if that works. Back over in the browser, I just refreshed my page. If I put in test, 1, 2, 3, hey, look at that. It held on to all three values, so the extract function must be extracting the values from the post array and populating my variables with them. It's the variable values that I'm putting into those fields. So it looks like that's working all right. Okay, how's my validation working? There I have error messages for last and zip, there for first and zip, there for first and last, just first, just zip, and if I give it all the data, I get no errors at all. So it looks like the fundamental basics of the validation are working fairly well at that particular point. The next thing I might like to do, though, is see what I could do to clean this up a little bit, to make it a little bit nicer, a little bit friendlier towards the user. One thing I might like to do, for example, is what if there are no errors? I had mentioned that in this case, if there are no errors, I'd like to display a message letting them know, congratulations, form is correct. How would I do that the way that my script is currently coded? Well, one thing that comes to mind is that I could maybe create a variable, a numeric type variable, a variable I could use to hold a number, and every time I found an error I could add one to that number, and then I could have an if statement that checks for the number in that variable and then uses it to decide with an if statement whether to show the congratulations message or not. That's a possibility. But to go along with that idea, there's also a few other problems here. One is that I would kind of like to format those error messages a bit. Instead of just having them as plain echoes, I think maybe I'd like to fancy them up a little bit with some CSS, put them into a list, maybe put the list into some kind of styled div in the page so the whole thing looks a little bit nicer. I would also like to eventually get to the point where I could come down and actually format the fields, so any field that had an error could get a special style applied to it to draw the user's attention to it. Given all of those different problems, plus the fact that I'm not crazy about having this big chunk of PHP code here inside the body of my page, I think I might swap some things around a little bit and see how it works. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take my basic validation code that's currently in the body of my page and I'm going to cut it out and I'm going to move it up to the head section instead. Drop it in up here instead. What I might then do up here is, since I now have my big if statement that checks to see if the form has been submitted, I'm going to take my extract function and I'm going to move it inside that if. There's really nothing to extract unless the form's been submitted anyway, so might as well do that. It makes logically a little bit more sense to me. The other thing I think I might do up here is, instead of actually echoing the error messages, which at this point would not be a smart thing to do, I don't want to be spitting out text before my HTML document is even started. What I might do instead is maybe take those error messages and store them away in an array. So I'm going to here create an array. I'm going to call it my errors array. And then if I find an error message with the first name, instead of echoing it, I'm just going to take that error and put it into the errors array. There is a PHP function for arrays that's very handy here called array push. The array push function lets you simply take a value and shove it into an array. So I can say push into the errors array this error message, kind of like that. Same basic thing with the other error messages then. I will push into the errors array my last name error message, and finally, a few typos aside, I will push into the errors array my zip code error message. I'm taking the brakes off. They're not really needed at that point, since I'm going to, in the end result, turn this, I think, into an unordered list. Alright, so what happens now, if you think about it, is if the page is first visited, first time the page is visited, no forms data submitted, we create variables to hold those three values, we create an errors array. We then check to see if the form's been submitted. Since I just said we're pretending that it hasn't, right? We skip all that. So really all we have is an empty array and three variables. We come on down, the user sees the form, and the form is filled with blanks, kind of like the user would probably expect to see. The user fills in the form though. When they submit it then, we create our errors array and our three variables. We see that the form is submitted. We take the submitted values the user gave with extract and put them into our individual variables. We then check first name, last name, and zip code to see if they're valid. If they're not, we put errors into the errors array. Well, what do we then do with the errors array? Well, I could make use of that errors array down here in the body of my document then. I could at this point do something like say, if the count, meaning the size, of the errors array, if it's greater than 0, then that means that I have errors. Using the alternate syntax, since I'm going to be combining a lot of HTML and PHP here, I'm going to create a div. I'm going to give it an ID of error explanation. I already have some CSS set up to style a div called error explanation. Inside that div, I'm going to create an H2. I'm going to say the form was invalid. And then I want to create an unordered list. And in that unordered list, I want to show all the error messages of what went wrong. Well, all my error messages are stored there in the errors array, so I can just loop through that array in order to show the errors. So let me use a for each loop, which will be a quick, easy way to be able to go through the array. Again, I'm using the alternate syntax. So for each of my errors, taking each one, let's say, as message. Let's see, then inside the loop, just create a list item for each one of those. And for each one of those list items, I will simply echo the message. Let's see how that works. If I jump back over to my browser, refresh the page, if I submit my form blank, there we go. You can see my CSS for styling that. All three of my error messages show up. It looks like it works okay. If I fill in some data, you can watch error messages disappear as the form is in different levels of being valid or not. It looks like it works just fine. All right. I like this quite a bit better. I like separating, as I've mentioned before, my PHP from my HTML as much as possible. So here I've taken the bulk of the PHP code and I've put it up here at the top of the page, up and away from the HTML itself. The only PHP that's left in the actual HTML itself at this point is the PHP that deals directly with generating or dealing with the actual HTML. Basically the PHP that really can't be anywhere else is kind of the idea here. I think it works pretty well. The one other thing I think that I wanted to be able to do in this particular script when there is an error is that I wanted to be able to actually mark fields as having errors. I've again set up a little bit of CSS to make that a little bit easier on myself. Basically the way my CSS is set up is that whenever I have a container like a paragraph with a label and input field in it, if that container, the paragraph for example, is marked with a class of error field, then my CSS will automatically cause the field to get a red border and the label to become red. So that's the styling I want. So really the idea here is if a field has an error, I want to put in the error field class for it. If a field doesn't have an error, I don't want to put in the error field class. Well, how could I do that? Well, up here, when I was actually putting those values into my errors array, I was basically putting them into the errors array and letting the errors array essentially act as if it were a numeric array. So all that's really in my errors array is the error message itself. If I were to change that though, instead of doing an array push here into the errors array, if I instead said into the errors array into a key with the name first name, assign the value of that error message, then I'm still getting the error message stored in my array, extra parenthesis there it looks like. I'm still getting the error message stored in my array, but now I'm storing it by the name of the field that that error goes with. Now the reason that I think this might be a good change is that when I want to be able to check to see if an individual field has an error, I could just check to see if the key for that field's name exists in the errors array. So let me swap these other two out and do them that same way. There's last name and there's zip code. Let me go ahead and try out and see how things work. Back to my browser, I'm going to refresh my page. If I submit, my regular error messages are still working fine. What I should now be able to do is when I want to be able to decide if a opening paragraph tag is going to have error field in it or not, is I could basically do that just with an if statement. I could say if is set in the errors array something with the key of first name, essentially meaning there's an error in the errors array for something called first name. Then I could display a paragraph that has a class of error field. Otherwise, I could just do a regular paragraph tag. So here, if there's an error for first name, start the paragraph with error field. Otherwise, don't. There's other ways that that could potentially work as well, but I think this is relatively clean. I want to do the same thing for my other two fields, so let me copy that bit of code, the opening paragraph for my last name field. I'm going to drop it in there, and I'm going to change it so it's looking for last name errors. And then the same thing for zip code, telling it to look at the zip code, look for zip code errors. There we are. And let's see how that works. Visiting the page fresh, everything looks nice and clean. The code itself, I don't see any errors hidden away from me in there anywhere. If I submit the form, all the fields that have errors are marked in red. I have nice friendly error messages up at the top. If I put in some data, firecracker, right? The error message goes away and the field is no longer marked as being an error field. Put in a zip code, 74119. There we go. The only error I have now is I have a problem with the first name. Right? If I put in the first name, there we are. That looks like it does a pretty good job. What we've done at that point then is we validated the form to our own specifications, made sure the data is set up the way that we want it to be set up, but we've also tried our best to make it as easy on the user as possible for them to be able to complete the form to our satisfaction. A lot of abandonment of websites or of actions on websites take place at forms. A lot of people visit websites and then it's when they encounter a form of some sort that they end up giving up on the website, giving up on the process because the form is just too difficult to use. They're too frustrated by it. So anytime you are going to put a user through some type of form that has validation associated with it, it's usually well worth your while to do everything you can to try and make it as easy on them as possible to be able to complete that form as easily as possible. The only last thing in here then is that I'm still not actually displaying my little error message that tells the user the form is valid. Let me go back. And you might remember that I had this if statement that checks to see if there are any errors in the errors array before it goes and shows the error explanation. Well, showing a message letting the user know that the form is okay would just be a matter here of adding an else along with that if statement. So here we're saying if there are greater than 0 errors in the errors array, show them the error messages. Otherwise, then we could just say the form is complete and valid. There we are, my little message at the end. Like I said, in a more realistic version of that script, that message would never be necessary, but just to complete it the way I'd originally described it to you, I wanted to go ahead and throw that in.